Hello and welcome to the February 10th edition of the DRF Players Podcast, brought to you by DRF Bets. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, joined, as always, by co-host Mike Hogan. Mike, how you doing today?
Doing great, Pete. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic because we have a special lineup of guests for today's show. We're going to actually start off just you and me talking a little bit about Gulfstream.
Sure.
Then we're going to reach out to the west coast of America and bring in the fantastic DRF correspondent Steve Andersen to talk about some of the action going on at Santa Anita this past weekend. And then we're going to go from out west to upstate New York to the man cave of NHC champion Paul Matties. And we're going to bring in Paul to talk about a little bit of handicapping contests, being a professional horse player, etc., etc.
It's a beautiful Ballston Spa, right?
That's right, Ballston Spa, where you and I have both spent some time.
Yes.
But normally I would want to chit-chat. I'd want to tell you all about going to see the Beach Boys at King's Theater last night. We'll put a pin in that for Friday's show, which will be a little loosier-goosier.
Okay.
I know you had some thoughts about the racing at Florida this weekend, and where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the turf handicap or the Don?
Well, we can start with either, whichever you want to start with. But you know, I do think we need to touch on. There were 8 graded stakes last weekend, and there were only 2 grade 1s. They were both in South Florida. So though we're going to go deep with Steve on the West Coast in the Santa Anita races, which certainly have implications for the Derby and the Oaks and whatnot, I do think it's important to talk about the 2 grade 1s first.
I totally agree. I mean, Mishawish to me, I know other people pronounce that name differently.
Mishawish?
I can't. Mishawish seemed to be Larry's preferred pronunciation. But he's now a grade 1 winner on 2 surfaces. Got a terrific ride from Johnny Velasquez. Used the tactical speed to get the perfect trip.
Nice little pickup mount there.
Not too bad. And will now be heading over to Dubai, where he ran 3rd last year in the turf. Going to try the dirt this time. Is this guy the real deal? Is he the 2000 whatever decade we want to call this, the aught-teens version of Cigar, or what?
Well, I don't know. I mean, how many grade 1s did Cigar win on the turf?
Fair point. Fair point.
You know, I think that might be going a little far. I mean,
being hyperbolic.
Yes, the Don was a fine field. It's certainly a little better than what we saw on the West Coast in the San Antonio. But I don't know if he beat the top horses, the top older horses in North America in winning the Don. You know, look, Valid's a good horse. He ran 2nd there. I don't know if he wants 9 furlongs. And, you know, let's face it, he does his best work at Gulfstream Park, and seemingly so does Mishawish as well. And
well, I was going to say that you famously said before on this podcast, even though we think you might have cribbed it from somebody else, that when it comes to Todd Pletcher, sometimes what happens at Gulfstream stays at Gulfstream. And now we have a horse who's run 10 times in North America, 4 for 4 at Gulfstream Park, and 0 for 6 everywhere else. How much are you going to consider that when thinking about betting this horse in his next start, wherever? Well, it'll be in Dubai when Mishawish next appears.
You know, I don't know. I think there's a little bit of noise in those numbers, but certainly it does seem kind of striking that he does his best work, whether it's on turf or on dirt, in South Florida. So. You know, maybe the oats are better in South Florida. He likes the stall a little bit. But, you know, I think he's a legitimate horse, and I think he's obviously one of the players in the World Cup, along with Frosted and California Chrome. And, you know, and even though if you're in Dubai, you won't be able to bet at the windows there, you know, you can certainly bet the race through DRF Bets. And it'll be interesting to see who goes favored from those 3.
The other horse I want to talk about out of the Don is Keen Ice, who I thought
he'll be going too.
Yeah, did not have much of a chance given the flow there, and I thought while he didn't do a ton of running down the lane, that still could end up being a perfect sort of prep race, and not unlike a style of training we've seen from Romans before. Is Keen Ice a sleeper for that race?
Hey, perhaps. I mean, some of it depends upon how the track has been playing, and I think the relatively new dirt surface in Dubai had been favoring early speed. If that continues, you know, he may be up against it unless there's a complete pace collapse in there. But, you know, who knows? I think he'll be somewhat overlooked. He'll probably be the 4th choice of those 3. Maybe not. Maybe he'll be vying for 3rd choice, but I don't see him being favored. so he could be a little overlooked.
Let's move on to the Gulfstream Park Turf Handicap, a race I know you have some thoughts on.
Yes.
It was won by Luke Sally.
Yep.
The horse who's got a terrific running style to be a player in this division going forward. Can stay close and seems to have that little bit of a kick down the lane. What were your thoughts on this race?
Well, there was, and I didn't really see many people talking about it. I noted it on Twitter, but there was what I consider to be a huge, huge, huge late change. No scratches, nothing, no jockey changes, but an incredibly important change that came up with all the late changes on the morning of the race, which is the turf rails moved from 0 feet to 96 feet. And in my estimation, at that point, I completely rehandicapped the race. And all of a sudden, early speed like Shining Copper, a stalker like Luke's Alley become much, much, much bigger players. And an off-the-pace horse like the Pizza Man, who was going to be a short price, becomes way more vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's generally the rule of thumb when it comes to turf rails. This would be an interesting question maybe to talk to our guests about today. But the further out that rail is, typically speaking, the better it is for early speed. And then you throw in the fact that Shining Copper, by his standards especially, set a slow pace, really, for what he's capable of. It's almost like the other jockeys just considered that he wasn't, I don't know if they considered he wasn't in the race, or they just decided they didn't want to compromise themselves by attacking. And it did end up being very much of a difficult situation for the closers in there. The other one, he had the obvious trouble in the stretch, all included. I thought maybe he would have gotten second without getting bottled up down on the rail there if he'd gone outside instead, just the way that things worked out. Didn't work out so well for him. I don't think anybody was beating the winner, though.
No.
Luke Sally. I think it just set up perfectly for his running style. How serious of a player in the division is he, or has he been in the right place at the right time?
I think he's legit. I mean, we'll see. But look, this is a horse that now is 10 straight races in multiple surfaces at Woodbine and on the turf. 10 straight races in the exacta. He's never been out of the exacta going long, except for once, and that was on soft turf. It seems like he could be in a division that has some question marks with the older males on turf. He could be a player. I mean, I don't see why not.
Before we move on and bring in our first guest, Steve Andersen, I just want to let folks know that for a lot more information on not only the races we just talked about, but all of the best weekend stakes action, you want to go to the DRF.com main page, and you want to navigate over to the race review videos that our guys do on Mondays. They're fantastic breakdowns. You see of the races, you see the videos playing, you hear Mike Beer, you hear Dan Illman, you hear Matt Bernier talking about their views of these races. They'll often also be covering them on DRF Live, giving their quick takes, but this is, with the benefit of a little bit of hindsight, a chance to go back and make evaluations. And I think, especially for those of you who are Formulator Notes users like we are, great to go back and listen to that, see if there's any information that resonates that you didn't pick up, slug that right into your notes section on DRF Formulator. It's just another great resource for horse players that you can get at DRF.com.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, without further ado, we're going to reach out to the West Coast. Even though the Grade 1s were in Florida, I think the eyes of the racing world this weekend were in California, and we have a first-hand observer to bring in right now who got to see all the action out at the Great Race Place. This is Steve Andersen. Steve, how you doing?
Very well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the podcast. We've been meaning to find excuses to have you on, and we've got a few of them coming up in the next few months with not only all the great Southern California action, but also all the great racing from Cheltenham we're looking forward to in March. A quick diversion before we get down to business here. Do you know your travel plans? Are you going back to the Cheltenham Festival this year?
Everything is set.
Ooh, fantastic. I'm so envious. Not only am I not going to be there because I'm going to be covering our Ultimate Betting Challenge out at Santa Anita,
right.
But I'll be having to get up at 5 in the morning or whatever it is to watch, to make sure I don't miss any of the fantastic racing out there. So we'll return. Yeah.
You check DRF Live when you wake up, and there'll be some very wise selections for all 4 days.
Fantastic, Steve. Always looking forward to your thoughts from over there, and also some of the experiential knowledge that you bring. It's that'll be something we'll try to figure out a way before you leave or something to have you on. We'll do a little mini preview on a podcast before that begins in earnest. But I think what folks, now that I've buried the lead thoroughly, let's head back to.
Before we do that, though, let's put Steve on the spot for just a couple minutes. Whenever this is the first time you've been on the podcast, Steve,
that's true. Yes.
Whenever we have new guests, we like to have them give a little bit of background. Obviously, people are familiar with you if they read the racing form. But how did you get into racing? How did you get your start? What made you want to do this as a career? And talk about in a minute or two how you ended up now sitting on a phone and talking on this podcast.
Well, in '85, I turned 18, and when you live in Dallas, there's no racing nearby. And I was working at the Dallas Morning News as an agate clerk and a phone clerk. I was just out of high school, and during my senior year, I worked there and got to see the whole sports department. And racing was something that I always followed during the Triple Crown as a sports fanatic as a young man, but I never had a chance really to see much more about it than that. So when I turned 18 that summer, I took a few trips to Louisiana Downs, and over the course of my freshman year at North Texas State University, I took a lot of general courses, but I was unknowingly becoming a major in handicapping, and so that resulted in a few journeys to fairgrounds and my first ever trip to Oakland in the spring of '86 as a so-called college freshman, and it just mushroomed from there. And because of my association with the Dallas Morning News, I had opportunities that most people wouldn't have to see the game a little more closely. And at the time, I was writing about a variety of sports, but I was getting rather sick and tired about dealing with petulant athletes when I had an opportunity to go watch some very elegant racehorses do things in an atmosphere in which I was totally unexposed and brand new and fascinated by. And it's never really changed. I left the Morning News in '89 and was the publicity director at Ruidoso and Los Alamitos. I was one of the publicity staff at Los Alamitos in 1989. I went back to Dallas for a year, and then I came back to California and worked in quarter horse racing for 3 years before joining the racing forum in 1994. So yeah, that's kind of how things have started. It's been in 22 years in California later this year.
That's amazing. So the work aspect of racing and the fan aspect of racing for you have been kind of intertwined from the beginning. Is that safe to say?
It is, and when you go through as a racing fan, you're fascinated at various times by betting on racing, the people involved, and more importantly to me now, the storytelling. Whether it's the previewing of race at Santa Anita this Friday, which I'm working on right now, or looking towards something in a much more bigger picture, such as the big races at Santa Anita at the 1st of March, or a journey overseas a week later. And it's kind of fascinating to see the game in that and be able to convey what you know to the reader, no matter how interested they are, whether they're dedicated diehard racing fans or whether they just like to follow the races on Saturdays. And I'd say one of the more vivid examples of that over the last 2 or 3 years, 4 or 5 years really, is being so close to Zenyatta from 2007 to 2010, and knowing that everything that you wrote was going to be read extensively. And I think now, to put that in a more modern context, you see it with California Chrome. There's such a widespread interest in him from all sorts of fans that you really feel a responsibility and a privilege to be able to call up Art Sherman at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night sometimes and say, so what's the plan for tomorrow's training again, please? And, but also really to kind of go into the barn office in the morning quite early when they're getting him ready and just be part of that and try to take some of that and put it into an article and let people who can't be there feel like they're closer to something that they've enjoyed watching.
Tell me what it is about West Coast fans. Are they just fortunate that we've had this bunch of horses in the last few years out there for them to develop such cult followings and beyond cult followings, where bringing in all these people, California Chrome bringing 40,000 to Del Mar in the fall or whatever it is, there are countless examples of the California fans rallying around their horses. What do you attribute that to?
I think it's an appreciation of a good horse, really. I mean, that was the case we saw to a large extent with Zenyatta. She was almost worth 10,000 people at the gate. California Chrome, I think, has probably got about a 5,000 person at the gate, in January when he was in the San Pasquale with Santa Anita. if he comes back and runs at Del Mar in the summer or San Anita in the fall, I think that number will increase because awareness increases. And it's not so much what we see from the bottom line parimutuel aspects of the sport. It's awareness in other ways. Like I go out and around my town in Seal Beach, which is near LaSalle, and people knowing that I'm in racing, they tell me things about the horse, what they've learned. Now, a lot of it is basic stuff, but it's interesting to me that oftentimes they don't discuss racing with me, but when we have one of those leading runners, their interest and their knowledge is fairly strong. They see it in various forms of media, and therefore you kind of see that racing is getting into the sports world, not just the racing world. You always wish that was higher and more intense, but sometimes you have to take what you can get, and this is an opportunity, case in point, in the second half of this year, California Pro comes back from Dubai, where promotions and awareness can really be increased for the sport of racing in Southern California.
I think people who try to take that A leads directly to B approach, saying, oh, well, handle didn't increase after Zenyatta, therefore Zenyatta didn't have an effect. I think that's short-sighted, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about, Steve, of these horses get into the wider culture and create fans maybe down the line or create memories that are going to continue to keep people coming into the sport. Do you think, am I being a little naive about that, or do you think I might be onto something?
No, I think you're onto something in so much as, they may become aware or more aware of racing through these leading runners, but it's racing's job to bring them back out on a random Saturday or on any day really, and get them to be engaged in the sport. And that's something that is always easier to say than to do, because there's so many other things that people have going on in their lives, various events they can attend or just things they just want to do that sometimes in the afternoon at the races and that isn't as convenient. So that's the thing. Yes, you created these leading runners, these stars, as people have so desperately asked for. Now what do you do with it?
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, let's pivot to this past weekend, and it's a good segue because we're talking about equine stars, and we saw one who looks a superstar out there in the Las Virgenes. How good is Songbird, Steve?
I don't know. I just don't know. She is beyond category right now. Her win was so effortless that she was galloping on the lead in the last furlong. And Landover C, who she beat by 6.5 lengths technically, has now run 4 times behind Songbird in consecutive races. The Street Fancy, who won the Los Starlet Stakes, hit her head on the gate just moments before the start and lost any chance she had of being in the first 3, and I really should say being second or third. So in that sense, the race didn't produce the competition level that was expected. But Songbird is beyond good. She's going to be very exciting to watch. They seem to be very adamant about the filly and mare division, and the filly division this spring, and then maybe fillies and mares later. Rick Porter, of course, owned 8 Bells, the ill-fated filly from the Kentucky Derby several years ago, and he hasn't any interest in running Songbird in the San Anita Derby or the Kentucky Derby. So really, even at this point right now, Songbird, I know there's not a Kentucky Oaks future book this weekend, but even money, 4 to 5.
I mean, I think there's a chance, if things continue to go along these lines, I think there's a chance she could be well shorter than that, believe it or not, going into the gate. I mean,
well, some of that would be factored into whether or not she actually makes the gate, but if all things being equal, she's 1 to 2.
Yeah, or I was thinking maybe even shorter than that.
Well,
based on these examples. Now I'm saying all this just from looking at it just from a purely handicapping point of view. I think there were a lot of people out there who were surprised that the figure was not even higher than it was based on the visual impression of the race. I was thinking that this was another one of those situations, not unlike ones that we described on the podcast last year in several of American Pharoahs races, where I truly believe, even though this is an overstated thing in racing and it's usually not true, I think it's true in this case, that she could have run, conservatively 5 to 10 lengths faster. Does that jibe with your assessment, Steve?
At least 5. I think it's probably a good number because, as stated, Smith just geared her down really outside the 8th pole. He was so far. He was 6 lengths in front with a quarter of a mile to go, and he was in front by 10 because of momentum at the 8th pole and won by 6.5. But it really was just. I've seen workouts that were more strenuous than this from bad horses. It was, I'm just looking at the chart here, and I said widen, and this is what Mike Schneider wrote. He says, opened up on the second turn and widened to mid-stretch, then proved clearly best under a long, loose hold. Mike is a very conservative chart writer. He doesn't, he doesn't get carried away with his thoughts and things. And when he writes things like that, it is just his way of saying it was phenomenal.
I described it as a double handful the whole way around, and then yeah, eased in the last eighth. And I thought that Frank Mirmati on the call nailed it, describing it as a privilege to watch. And then Smith after the race comparing her to Inside Information. I thought that was some interesting praise, and made me think we should probably tweet the PPs of Inside Information to the podcast listeners, for maybe some of the younger ones who don't realize what a tremendous compliment that one was. Oh, you go ahead, Steve.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm almost thinking now that we're seeing a repeat of 2009 with Rachel Alexandra. I think she might be that kind of filly, where she can just, even later in the year, maybe she will face the males in some race, in some form. But there's a lot to like about what we've seen so far from her.
You mentioned Porter's resistance to running against the boys. Excellent article on DRF.com right now by our colleague Jay Hovde with an interview with Porter discussing the specifics of that. Won't bother to get into that one here, but that's just an example of the kind of info you can get when you're checking out DRF.com.
Well, Steve, I know you hinted at the possibility of certainly not in the Derby or not on the Derby Trail even running against the boys, but maybe later in the year trying males. I know our buddy Jake Luft here at the DRF is certainly hoping that that's the case, because when he was in Vegas for the NHC, he put a little money on Songbird to win the Beaters Cup Classic at 100 to 1.
Not a bad gamble.
No, no.
It comes down to issues like her development over the next 6 months. I think when you look past, let's say, the Triple Crown time, I know that Jerry's got the Kentucky Oaks on his radar, but what she does behind that is hard to say. She will be hitting the road, during the summertime. You've got races such as the Acorn, the Delaware Oaks. You've got the Cotillion is worth a lot of prize money in Philadelphia in late September. But the same token, you want to come back here to California, because you've got the Zenyatta Stakes, a Grade 1, preceded and followed by the Breeders' Cup Distaff, and maybe some of their decision will be predicated on what Beholder does, how she's racing, and things like that. There's so many variables that will take place through the calendar year, but I will tell you this, that the April 9th program with the San Anita Derby and San Anita Oaks on it is a must-watch day. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a fun afternoon to be there, because she should be in that San Anita Oaks, and then of course the San Anita Derby looks like it'll have Mor Spirit perhaps, so it's going to be something to consider as one of the top days of April.
That sounds like the perfect segue to talk about Mor Spirit, who won the Bob Lewis in a race, in an effort that I've heard described in various ways. So I'll just ask you, Steve, what did you think of Mor Spirit's effort there?
He did what he was expected to do, which was to win the race as a heavy favorite smartly. And what was exciting about the performance was Stevens was always where he wanted to be. Gary Stevens was always where he wanted to be on the colt. He had him well placed early on, although a little bit wide. But when he asked him, like in the last quarter mile, the response was steady, and the response looked very professional. And you can blind this performance in the Robert Lewis against a modest field, let's be honest, combined with the way he had won at Los Alamitos when he was still having a little bit more to prove. It indicates that he is undisputedly the number one 3-year-old in California. It's a group that's starting to get kind of form a little bit. Cupid for Baffert again, a nice maiden winner on Sunday. Looks like he's on the upswing. You've got Danzig Candy won last Thursday in an allowance race. He's going in the right direction, and the smoky image of the California bred did very well in his first start around 2 turns in the Little Cal Cup Derby back on January 30th. So there's some nice 3-year-old, but Mor Spirit really is at the top of the list right now. California's had 3 of the last 4 Kentucky Derby winners have been based at Santa Anita or in Southern California. So you begin to wonder, is Mor Spirit good enough to be another one of those, or is he just the best of a moderate group?
Now, Bob Baffert and his camp are known for putting out vibes about their horses. Certainly no better example of that last year than when heading into the Derby, when it just seemed like if you got close to that camp, you got the impression that they thought that American Pharaoh was many, many lengths better than Dortmund, whereas just looking at the 2 on paper, it would be a coin toss. what are the vibes? What are you hearing on the ground about the Baffert camp and what they think of this horse?
Highly positive. Not necessarily that level of conversation, but certainly one in which there's a wide anticipation of what he can do over the next 90 days, and there's a lot to look forward to there. He's got a really nice running style. He has a stalking silver charm style where he can be near the front, very handy, very easy to place, and that's such a huge asset because when races unfold in certain ways, it doesn't necessarily go for certain horses. If they go too quick, it looks like Stevens has the horse underneath him who can be a lot more patient at the right time, and that's vital. That's vital when you get into these big fields with these somewhat chaotic races at times, particularly on May 7th, potentially at May 7th at Churchill.
Baffert has described him as a horse who kind of pulls himself up late sometimes. That could be, I can read that one either way. On one hand, it sounds like a little bit of a character flaw maybe. On another hand, hey, maybe if that's something he can figure out and gets a little bit better about running through the wire, maybe he can find a few more lengths. I thought he galloped out pretty well the other day. What's your gut about how far this one wants to go, Steve?
He'll go the distances. He shouldn't have any difficulty going 1.25 miles. But what is fascinating about him in context of what you just said is I hated 2 of his 3 preceding workouts. I went, this horse is going to be favored next time, and you watch him and he's just not really that enthusiastic about working. Even when he's in company, he kind of just does enough to be what's typically an allowance class stablemate. And you think, this horse isn't going to win anything. And yet here we are talking about him after a second consecutive, Kentucky Derby Prep Stakes win. And so look to Mor Spirit as being more of an afternoon horse than a morning horse, the kind that you want.
Yes, yes. Sometimes I think that's a sign of a smart horse, that they sort of know when they're training and they know when it's go time.
That's for real.
I've heard some conflicting things about this horse's next start. You seem to indicate that he's going to stay home. I'd also heard that Baffert was thinking about maybe shipping him. What do you know definitively about the plans for Mor Spirit?
That Baffert changes his mind probably twice during our podcast, and we'll probably do so 2 more times.
Sounds like the Travers last year.
I'll put off the response to say that whatever I would say is very subject to change, and he's definitely probably going to think things through. He doesn't have to do anything right now, and that's one of the benefits is they've got a good head start on the season the way they want it to do. And if he goes down to Florida for the Derby, that's great. They're chasing a bonus related to a sale company promotion, and that's one way of going about things. But at the same time, he's already shipped once and run well. You want to ship him again because he's going to start hitting the road, and they've got a lot of factors to play into. And there's good prize money in California. The San Felipe on March 12th is $400,000. It's going to be a very good prep to the San Diego Derby on April 9th, which is $1 million. So there's definitely reasons to stick around.
All right, we're going to let you go in a couple of minutes, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the San Antonio, where we had 2 horses who have a little bit of trouble finding the winner's circle, battling down to the line in Opportunity and Imperative. It was sort of like an immovable object meets unstoppable force thing. Something had to give. One of them had to win.
Right.
In the end, it was...
And they almost both won.
It could have been a heater. In the end, it was Opportunity who got that nose down on the line. What were your general thoughts of the San Antonio, Steve?
I wasn't impressed with the race at all. I mean, you have to reflect 12 months ago, it was Shared Belief in California Chrome, and this year it's Opportunity and Imperative. I mean, I'm sorry.
Well, and Steve, you go back the year before last year.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember what 2014 was?
I'd have to. I've just drawn a blank right now.
Don't worry, Steve. He does this to me all the time.
I'll refresh your memory. It was Blingo and Imperative. So,
so I can't imagine why you couldn't remember that battle between immortals of the turf, Steve. Come on, get your act together.
I apologize. This is the race that is going to send Opportunity to Dubai for some reason. And this is the race that more wisely is going to send Imperative into the San Diego handicap with a leading chance. And that's fine. Richard Baltus said it Sunday morning when I visited with him. I said, what are you going to do? He goes, I'm staying home. There's plenty of good races in the United States, and this is one of them for mine. And he's thinking he's got a horse that should have won on Saturday. Smith had him in a little bit of traffic at the top of the stretch. It didn't have the perfect run through the last quarter mile. And if he does have a better run, he probably beats Opportunity. Remember, Imperative wasn't going to beat California Chrome on January 9th in the San Pasquale, but he did run down the stretch with interest, and he ran very well to be beaten that day. and he's better now, and I think he's probably going to come out of the race. The one who will come out of the race and do well is him, because the Vicinity handicap at this point is very weak. Dortmund's not ready. California Chrome's 8,000 miles away. Opportunity's leaving town. Dawnworth, who ran third in his first start for Doug O'Neill, may leave town to go to Dubai, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
And
I would have thought he would have been a leading light if he stayed home. Interesting. I hadn't heard that.
But they had talked as recent as last week when he came up as the San Antonio probable starter, that they saw this as a prep to Dubai. Well, I don't agree. I think they've got a horse, as you just stated, that would be very, very good and even have a leading chance in $1 million Sandy to handicap. But the argument is, look, if we run third in Dubai, it's the same as what you get for running first in Santa Anita. Well, that's true.
It's a fair point. I mean, it's a fair point.
Well,
I just thought that Dawnworth.
It's a fair point until you include the fact that competition in the Santa Anita handicap will not include Frosted, Mashalish, California Chrome, a player to be named later. And
It's,
come on.
Yeah.
And to me, that race for Dawnworth shaped like a nice start to a campaign if spotted sort of properly. It didn't exactly suggest he's ready to dive into the deep end of the pool. It just suggested to me that he could be a solid horse. So no, I mean I understand the economic incentives to go around the world, but I'm with you. I'd rather see him stay local, and we'll see. Maybe when they look at that lineup and they look at who's going to show up at home, maybe they'll change their mind about that one.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today. We're going to have you on the show, as often as you'll allow us to bother you and make you work a little bit extra. But
Steve, one quick question before you go. I mentioned this on Twitter. I feel like it's worth bringing up in the podcast. Be honest here. Were you the one that hammered that Mor Spirit to Songbird double?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, if I really do need to go in a minute because I'm on my way off to buy a new car. So it was all about that. I'll close with this. I had a buddy of mine who hit the late pick 4 at Santa Anita on a small ticket, and he kind of had a brain cramp and didn't bet the pick 6 that day when it was the first two keys, and I felt so sorry for him. I couldn't pick on him. I was like, oh man, that's a bummer.
Sure. Yeah, it was rare that you see the first leg, the win end of the first leg of a double, pay the same as the double.
Yep.
They both paid $340. So you just, and you could see that. You could see, my payout here is, 3 to 5, and my payout here is 3. You can see exactly what you're going to get for the win bet versus the double, and people still bet it.
For that matter, why bet Songbird to win when you get the same price to show?
Well, that's the other fair point.
All right, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be in touch very soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, the DRF Players Podcast, now brought to you by DRF Bets. I understand we have some specials going at DRF Bets. Mike, what's the story with that?
Well, there's the sign-up bonus. That's the best offer. If you don't have a DRF Bets account, you can go to drfbets.com/200. It's $200 sign-up bonus. If you join, no strings attached, really. You just deposit $200. They'll kick in $200. It's basically a deposit match. Plus, you get free DRF Plus access and you get free DRF PPs. So, why not?
So there's no betting limit. You get free access to all that stuff for being a DRF Bets member.
I think it's like $300 a month.
Wow, that's an excellent deal. That's better than I even realized it was.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have another very special guest coming up on the show, and that's Paul Matties, the 2016 National Handicapping Champion, and he's joining us now. If you're watching on YouTube, you can watch all the shows archived at the DRF YouTube channel. You can see him appearing in the corner of the screen there in his man cave in Ballston Spa. At least I think that's a man cave. Is that a fair description of where you're at right now, Paul?
Yep, that's it.
Paul, I love. I haven't met you, so nice to meet you. First of all, I'm Mike. Welcome to the podcast. But I love looking at you. It looks like you've got a little halo glow about you, and maybe that's just
that's what happens when you go out there and beat beat 500 other players, including your brother, to become the national handicapping champion. So when we last talked about this, Paul, it hadn't really set in. Now we've had a little bit of time in between your big win out there at Treasure Island for the NHC. Give me your thoughts on what it means to you to have won that honor.
Well, I kept picturing myself winning, but I could see that, but I didn't see all this other stuff that happened after. And I was reading somewhere where somebody thought it was that the NHC was bad value based on the chances of winning with the money you received or something. But I don't think I think all those people should reconsider, because all the extra things extra incentives that you get by winning, they're immeasurable, So you don't realize it until you win. So I guess that's some of the things I'm, realizing now and thinking about more.
Well, some of the other added value from that event, I think, comes from the people that you meet and the atmosphere. I mean, I saw you guys at your table. You looked like you were having a pretty good time, and I also know you obviously played in that event many times before you ever won it, and you still seem to enjoy being there. So, I mean, think about divorce the fact that you won the thing this year and talk about the experience of just being there in your previous times. I mean, it was obviously something that you felt like was worth pursuing even as a professional player, correct?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, there's no doubt when you're at the NHC that the feeling is that this is the championship, the Super Bowl, And I mean, the other part is just part of the racetrack that, unfortunately, because of simulcast and everything, you don't get to have those days like we used to. But you put 700, actually more, because the people working are horse racing fans too. You put that many people in a room that are horse players, and it's just going to be a good time. They're just the stories and about the races and the bad beats and and just other people winning. I mean, you nailed it. We were having a blast even before I got into contention. It was just it's an amazing atmosphere, that's for sure. And then when it got so that you made the cuts, it became more like the competition got, at least to me, and I think for my brother Duke, it takes you back to where you're actually playing a sport, or you're in a competition, and then the desire to win kicks in, and that's fun too. And you don't get to do that on an every day at the races. Just to have it be something you're relatively good at, and a competition. That's pretty. That's kind of what you live for.
It's fantastic. I know that you guys and your dad all played various sports when you talk about the competitive aspect. What were some of the sports that you and your family have played through your lives, to give people an idea of what you know about competition?
Well, my father, you bring him up. I always joke, he's like, he's good at everything. You wouldn't tell by looking at him, but he's an unbelievable athlete. He was quarterback on his high school team. He played college basketball and baseball. He was a pro bowler. He's a scratch golfer. He played, he's unbelievable at tennis, ping pong, pool. I mean, you name it, he's amazing. So I'm not as good as he was, but I was a pretty good baseball player, and my brothers were. Duke was a good pitcher, and we were all pretty good bowlers and golfers, and we weren't tall enough to play basketball when I was, but I'm a good shooter, and I played in as long as I could. So, and just almost any sport, any activity, that's why I think I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the people, that same competitive fighters, come through when you're handicapping too. It's, my father joked at my wedding that hitting a pick six was a athletic endeavor, and the guys there thought it was funny, but he really believed that. And this is somebody who, played athletics at a high level his whole life. So, I think just there's no doubt that that's part of it.
You want to jump in, Michael, with a question?
Well, yeah, so you mentioned your dad, and you live in upstate New York, you live near Saratoga. What were some, and that's, personally, that's how I got into playing the races and being a horse racing fan myself, was though I grew up in Southern California, my mom and dad both grew up in Albany, and I would spend my summers with my grandfather, and we would go to, he was retired, he would go to the office, which was the OTB. And then we would go to Saratoga. So that was kind of my experience. Did you have similar experiences getting into horse racing and becoming a fan yourself?
Absolutely. What you say about your grandfather, that's me. I would go to the OTB with my grandfathers. I could just show up there and both of them would be there.
Yep.
Yep. And
you knew all the characters.
Yeah. And during the summer, I lived further downstate than Saratoga, so it was a little bit of a trip, but we would drive, my grandfather would drive to the Meadowlands, the California or the Massachusetts fairs, and a lot of times we would meet my family and friends, other people that were there, even when younger, to Green Mountain when I was real little.
Sure.
So
legendary place.
It was and I said this before, but it's just something that I was really comfortable with at an early age. I just liked being at the racetrack, and I really liked the handicapping part of it.
Right. You give me a couple of segues there, because we're definitely going to talk about handicapping. But I want to, before we leave the topic of Saratoga, just because I've had the pleasure of being back there with you guys, you have kind of a unique setup that I'd love for you to describe to folks. It's sort of like a Matties family reunion. At least that's what it looks like from the outside in the backyard. Describe for folks your current day setup at Saratoga.
Well, we don't discriminate. There's a big group of us, and we've adopted the Rotundo family from Horse Players fame. That I met them 15, 20 years ago, sitting back there, and
that's great.
And Joe Applebaum, who's the head of Off the Hook Stable, and just I met so many people back there. There's a painting of the Big Red Spring that was done by, unfortunately he passed away, the artist Alonzo, and
sure.
It's our group. Sitting in front of the TVs with the Red Spring in the background, and that's kind of like our, symbol, and it's just a good time. It's similar to the NHC. It's just racetrackers telling stories and having fun, and that's to me that's all it's about.
That's great. How much of the handicapping process did you learn from your dad?
Well, I think I have an advantage there because my father wasn't much of a speed figure guy, and I kind of, but he had some friends that were, and then I kind of learned it myself, the speed figure. So I kind of had, I learned the speed figures angles myself, but then my father's kind of more of a trainer angle guy and a trainer intent and logic. He likes to use a lot of logic in handicapping, and I think that was pretty much that was a big advantage I had because I kind of combined the two. And what I've noticed from everybody that in the last couple of weeks is that I think what people are interested in me is because I go about the handicapping a little bit different than what anybody's read about or what they've seen. And I think it's probably more because of my father's influence, the logic part of it, and try to think outside the box while using all the handicapping, the standard handicapping methods. But when you talk
about logic, you mean thinking like connections, why horses are in certain spots, or is there another aspect to logic that helps in your handicap?
Well, that would be the simplest form of it, but just trying to like, does this make sense? Like when I had a horse the other day that raised from 62.5 to 12.5, which you would think would be a pretty much, if you just look at on straight, if a computer program was doing it, for instance, that would be a pretty confident move. But just analyzing the whole situation and put yourself in the position of the owners and the trainers, I came to the conclusion, and even actually looking at the whole history of the horse and trying to imagine, what's happened to the horse's whole life, I came to the conclusion that it was negative. You know, even though he was making this, you know, double class price raise, you know, and I don't think most people would have came to that conclusion. And he didn't win. He didn't hit the board. And I was, you know, I didn't hit the race. I still missed. But, you know, those are the things that even afterwards I say, you know, that's, you know, you're confident about, you're on the right track when you can do stuff like that.
In that specific example, was the negativity associated with the fact that you thought they were just trying to run the horse where it wouldn't get taken or something like that?
I actually came to the conclusion that they thought they were going to get claimed. And
that's great.
You know,
and they would get more for 12.5 than.
Yeah, and I think I never went back and checked it, but I'm pretty sure he was claimed, and I think they knew it. That was I think they were trying to maximize what they could get for the horse, and I was right on, and just everything else that was around it. You know, it's hard to say when you're not looking at it, but
sure, no.
It just pointed that direction to me, you know, and I think, you know, that's just one example, but I think there's a lot of things that happen. I mean, 50 to 100 times a day where things like that happen, and you're not always right, obviously, but when you can do that and you're doing something that probably most of the public and definitely computer players aren't doing. You know, that's the thing that anybody who's handicapping now has to be aware that you're playing against computers, you know. So if I've done anything different in the last, you know, 5 years, is that I'm really aware of that, and any advantage I can get on somebody who's playing with a computer, I'm trying to take.
The Logic seems like one great example of that. Is there anything else that comes to mind, other areas where you've seen that the computer players are maybe a little bit weak?
Yeah, I think that there's some things in speed figures in pace figures particularly, that I think the computers, they're getting better at it, but I still think they're behind anybody who does pace figures. And again, I think it's because it's a little abstract, pace figures, so it's a hard thing to incorporate into a computer program. So I think that's probably another angle, and it's something else that I use more and more every day. You know, just I think there's some things in you know, the makeup of a horse that during a race that isn't just a figure. You know, there are situations that make the horse what I call downline, or, you know, the way I describe that is everybody who watches a race knows when they're beaten. You know, like, well, I'm not going to win because, you know, you don't see horses come back. Well, that means that the horse is downlined in my mind. And when a horse downlines, the acceleration part is over, you know, and, you know, that's stuff that I think that's a little out there that the computer people can't, you know, haven't, and I don't have it down yet either, but, you know, I think anything that you incorporate that way is, you know, an advantage.
Is there a particular, in terms of learning to make pace figures, is there a particular methodology that you subscribe to? I mean, there's obviously a few of the big names on that side of pace handicapping. Was one more influential than another to you?
Well, you know, not really, because I think I came about it in a different way than, it's a little bit like Randy Moss does on the DRF pace figures.
Sure.
It's similar to that, not exactly, but so I guess he's probably on the closest to me on a wavelength on that. But it's what you do with it, I think, that's more important than actually than figuring them. Though I think a lot of people try to do pace figures the same way as final figures, and the big mistake is that horses aren't full out during a quarter, you know, or the first half. So to say that they're going to run the same time every time is a mistake, and you know, to base anything based on what they had done the previous time in a pace figure would be a mistake. And I also think another mistake that people make with pace figures is that I don't think it's as simple as, you know, the slower you go, the more advantage it is for the horse on the lead, and the faster you go, it's a disadvantage. I think it's way more complicated than that. So to simply label it slow or fast is, you know, it's a start, obviously, but it's not that simple, really.
when you talk about that, I mean, do you think that is the big variable there, the individual horses? There are some horses, because of their acceleration, they want to slow it down as much, and it's an advantage to them, but other horses need to go a certain speed to be able to continue to go a certain speed and keep the other rivals behind them? Is that what the kind of thing you're talking about?
Part of it. You know, my father and I had a discussion, you know, that the jockeys today don't, there's a certain type of horse who likes to be a free-running horse, whose ability to run without downlining is the horse's advantage. And you know, you don't see it a lot like you used to, where the jockeys today are always trying to have the horses finish, and that becomes more of what, you know, sometimes people call a quicken. You know, so a horse who has a more, you know, a longer run, a sustained run, will get beat on the lead by a horse who just out quickens him in the last, you know, eighth of a mile. And if he had used his speed differently, he probably, you know, the other horse wouldn't have quickened as much, and he probably would have continued on. And he might have forced the horse to downline. You know, I think that's a lost art, because, you know, I think the older jockeys understood that. I think it's a combination of two things. Maybe Lasix and modern day medication allows the horses not to downline as easy. But the jockeys of the older, you know, the older generations understood that if somebody was on the outside of you, you wanted to make the horse work a little bit more than the guys today. And, you know, the horse on the lead when I was growing up was always an advantage. You know, Duke and I talk about it today. The horse with the advantage is the horse that's stalking. The horse that's on the outside stalking the slow pace. That's the, you know, to me, that's more of a measure of how the paces were going. You know, if there were 8 races and 4 horses stalked on the outside in slow pace, you know, that's kind of, we look at that more nowadays than we do than the horse that was on the lead.
That's fascinating. You just tell how ahead of the game these guys are from the level of the conversation. It's fascinating. Just to, you know, the pace handicapping I do is maybe at the 11th grade level, and this is postdoctoral stuff. So it's great to get a chance.
Well, I wouldn't say it's there yet either. I know we're going to see it go even further, because you know, I truly believe that's why horses win. That's my book title if I ever write one. Because
why horses win?
I know that's the key to why they win. You know, there's other things that go in. It's the key to winning a race. Let's put it that way.
That's great.
I had a question for you from on a personal level. You're a professional gambler. This is what you do for a living. At what point in your life did you realize, boy, I'm good enough at this that maybe I need to pursue this as a potential career? And how scary was that when you first made that leap?
Well, I had some advantages on that. I don't think that's an accident. I think I was lucky in that regard, because while I was in college, I got a job working for Andy Beyer doing figures. We were at what now is Briss. You know, it used to be Broadbent on an old computer TimeNet hookup, you know, computer system. And when the Racing Times started, and I got the job, when Andy got the job with Racing Times, putting the speed figures in the Racing Times, they needed people to do figures. You know, Mark and Andy both needed, and I was the guy. So I got a relatively full-time job doing speed figures. You know, how could you beat that? You know, and then coming along with that, you know, you had to be at the races. You know, you had to watch the races, and so I was put into an environment where I could try to become, you know, a gambler at that point. You know, and I was young. I didn't have a family. I remember, you know, when we went to Las Vegas originally, there was it was a time when it was advantage for players to go to they were given really big incentives for horse players to come to Las Vegas. And, you know, I was single, and my brother Duke was just out of college, you know, as well. And, you know, we went out there like it was nothing. And I looked around and other people couldn't go. And, you know, I think that's when it really, really kicked in, when we were out there, because that's when you really felt like you're living in Vegas, and you know, that's when it really kicked in that you could be a professional gambler. And it's not so frowned upon out in Las Vegas, which is...
Yeah, well, that's true, too. That's the famous Mike Maloney line about when people in your neighborhood find out you're a professional gambler and they invite you to the neighborhood party and they seat you next to the drug dealer.
Yeah, it's 25 years, doing it, and maybe even longer, a little bit longer, actually. And I'm still not comfortable with that. And that was probably the biggest thing that when I did move back to Saratoga. I wanted to be at Saratoga during the summer, and when my kids were born, I wanted them to grow up here. So, but that's the thing that's different, where my brother Duke stayed in Vegas for a time, and, he had no problem getting, a house mortgage or, being in a social environments, he was almost like a celebrity. And I didn't feel that way, and that was something that's hard to deal with, I think, for anybody who's doing it too.
How important is the company that you keep as a horse player?
Well, without a doubt, I think you can learn anything from anybody. That's and I learned that at a young age, hanging around OTBs like Mike did. It didn't matter where people came from, who they were, and especially when I went to some of the inner city OTBs in Buffalo. I met some real characters, and, I learned, some of that logic stuff and handicapping ideas that people have, from, people off the street, and I still learn every day. I'm listening to anybody, for when it comes to that. I'll always, listen to what somebody's got, because I said this before, and I think people thought I was joking, but, horse players are smart people. And they know horse racing, and they got something in their, that they do that's pretty good if they keep doing it. So, I don't discriminate on that for sure. I will try to learn from anybody.
I like it. No, I don't have any other questions.
I got a few more. I want to talk specifically about NHC weekend again for a minute. First one, what memories stand out to you when you think back on that weekend?
Well, the one horse is running today, all lights up.
Yeah.
I got to him in the form, and I was trying to handicap the race, which I actually like a horse net race. I like a different horse that ISO says, but I'm looking at his form line, and just a lot of things came creeping back into me, and they're all important when you win by $10 or $11, but that one really came to mind because I kind of called it ahead of time to everybody at the table, and I think everybody thought I was joking a little bit, but I really liked that horse, and that put me into a really good position, and so that moment really sticks up because I was going to make the cuts then after that. It put me in a spot where I didn't have to do anything crazy, and I knew it. I mean, I seized on that, and I'm pretty happy about that. I think one of the reasons why I won was that the format was different this year, and I was aware of it. I don't think a lot of people. First of all, I had the ability to be aware of it because I got with all lights up into the cut. But I think I played the strategy of the contest right, where maybe a lot of people were just kind of feeling it out. I kind of foresaw what was going to happen with more picks being picked, and with less turf racing, and kind of where the scores were going to be. And I think it was new to a lot of people, and I don't think they really comprehended, what might happen next, what you should do at certain times. I saw
what was the overall effect of those changes? In terms of the
big
scores?
Changes this year. Big changes.
Yeah. And
the 10 instead of 7 on the first 2 days.
For the optional plays.
On the optional plays, yeah, that was a big thing, because I just think the mandatories, what I did in the mandatory races, where I could go with horses I liked. Where in other years, if you were playing the 2-day tournament where it was a final, and even somewhat in the days when they had the first couple of years they had the final table, those mandatories were so important, and I didn't think they were this year. I just said, I'm going to get as many points as I could in those mandatories. I don't care what the odds were. You know, if I liked the long shot, I would take them, but most of the time I didn't. And you know, I think that was really key. And then the next day with 10 picks in a short period of time, you know, I think that really fooled some people where you had to get some winners, you know, and then I had my own preference that the mandatories were coming later. So once I got in front, I tried to, you know, get as big as lead as I could at that point. And I think I played the strategy well. I mean, you got to handicap well and you got to have winners, obviously. But I think on top of that, I think I played the strategy pretty good too.
All right, my last question for you is going to be about strategy, and it's going to be the strategy going into that final race. You're about $10 up. Roger Cetina has been on fire. You had looked uncatchable. Cetina got right up to your throat latch there going into that final race. You had Alert Bay, who looked like he was going to be too short. I'm assuming you thought you had the protection of Alert Bay. I think if I were looking at it, I would have been worried that Roger might have played the eventual winner that the Sormo rode, whose name I'm spacing on.
What of you?
What of you?
Yeah.
I would have been worried about that horse. I'm just curious, what was your thought process in you know, what was your sort of game theory making your decision in the last race, and how did it end up turning out for folks who don't know?
Well, one thing that I didn't realize at all that Roger would do is that I think he took the idea that he maybe could win if his horse ran second.
Soy Fett, right?
Yeah, and I didn't think he was going to do that at all. That really threw me off. You know, that he would take a real long shot and maybe if it just ran second. I didn't think he would even consider that. You know, and even though I kept my eye on Alert Bay, I didn't think he was going to take Alert Bay. He hadn't taken a favorite at all, and it was you really had to be gutsy to take Alert Bay because, you know, he would have had to
been
drift
drawn
up.
dead.
Yeah, he would have had to drift up to get point. But I kept an eye on it just in case, because if he got to the point, if Alert Bay got to the point where he could beat me, I was going to take him.
That's logical.
That was without I was going to do that. But then when he was lower and I was safe with him, I got a little confused, and I didn't know at the time that he was a thoroughgraph player, which I wish I had known.
You got to read my articles, man. It's right in there.
I blew that. I really blew that. And I watched a lot of things, you know, once I was in contention, you know, trying to find out as much as I could. But I wish I had known that. But I still probably wouldn't have figured that he would have picked So Fett. But it would have changed who I picked if I had known that. I just thought that I didn't think that anybody was going to take this horse. There was a lot of speed in the race. And all the horses that were in that range that What a View was in, there was about 4 or 5 of them that were between 5 and 10 to 1. And 4 of them were speed. And I just didn't think that he would take those horses. He hadn't taken speed horses in the whole thing. And I thought it would have been a really gutsy move to take, you know, a horse that could just get gutted right away. Now, as it turned out, it didn't run like that, and all the other ones rated, and One of You won. But I think that goes along with what I was thinking, that, you know, if you were going to take that was kind of a gutsy shot if you were going to do that. And I didn't think anybody would put their contest in that kind of spot. So that only left me with one horse, and that's kind of why I went in the direction I did. Unfortunately, I didn't have any opinion in the race at all. So, and I knew it was going to be trouble from the night before when I was looking at it. I said, if I'm in this position, I didn't know what to do. I kind of knew what to do I knew what I was going to do in those races previous, and I even called my wife right before the race prior, and I really was confident about Gutsy Ruler. And I said, if Gutsy Ruler runs first or second, I'm going to win, I told her. And I said, all you have to do is watch that. And I said it thinking that he was going to. I really thought I was going to win it in the race before it. So when he didn't win, it really put me in an awkward position in that last race. I was really relieved that, you know, I'm sure that the NTRA people weren't happy that it wasn't an exciting last race, but I certainly was relieved.
Well, did you get a chance to speak to Cetina at all after it was all said and done? What an achievement by him, friend of the podcast, Roger Cetina, I should point out also, to finish second twice in that event. How great is that?
Yeah, you know, like he's an inspiration for me next year. I'm going to try to use him. That you know, you can get right back up there.
Fantastic, fantastic. Wouldn't surprise me, given both of your tremendous skills and the way you play the game within the game, if you both ended up in the semifinals or maybe even the final table again next year.
Yeah, the horse players are going to catch up though on the strategy part. I don't think we're going to have an edge on that again. So it'll be straight handicapping. I'll have to work hard on that.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Always great to talk handicapping and contest strategy with you. We've come to the end of the February 10th edition of the DRF Players Podcast.
Thank you, guys.
I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale, for Paul Matties, for Mike Hogan. Until we see you next time, may you win all your photos.